with this. This is actually the third year in a row that we've collaborated with Jane Addams Branch. I also want to welcome any non-members who are on the program. I think our speakers shared the registration link with some of their friends, so we may have some non-AAUW members. Welcome to you. AAUW is providing about $6 million this year in funding for the more than 320 fellows and grantees in the 2022-23 award year. These exceptional recipients will pursue academic work and lead innovative community projects to empower women and girls. During the past 2 award years, 21 of the award recipients have been connected to the state of Illinois. That is, they either live here or decided to go to school here. Some of you may not realize that the idea for the AAUW fellowships actually originated here in the Midwest. There was an organization called the Western Association of Collegiate Alumni, and it was actually the forerunner organization of the Chicago branch of AAUW. In 1886, the Western ACA gave a graduate fellowship in the amount of $350 to Ida M. Street to study at the University of Michigan. So that was the very first, it's still listed on the national website as the very first fellowship given by AAUW. Today, there are 7 types of AAUW awards, 2 of which will be represented by the 3 speakers that we have with us today. American fellowships, so I'll be talking about 2 types. I won't be describing all 7 types. I'm just going to do American fellowships and career development grants. American fellowships are for women pursuing full-time study to complete dissertations or to conduct postdoctoral research, or for those preparing research for publication. You will hear from 2 American fellows today. Career development grants are for women pursuing a certificate or a degree to advance their careers, change careers, or re-enter the workforce in a variety of fields, including STEM and social sciences. You will be hearing from 1 recipient, and this award is really for people who've been out of school for at least 5 years. So this is people who are a little bit more mid-career. We hope that you will be suitably impressed with the impact that AAUW's awards program is having on these women, and consider making a donation to AAUW to keep these great programs going. I'll be introducing each speaker as we go along. If you do have questions or comments, as I said before, please put your questions into the chat, and then we will handle the questions at the end of after all 3 speakers have finished with their presentations. We are recording this, and for those of you who just joined us, so please keep your microphones on mute during the program so that we don't have to hear anyone's dog or whatever, or the construction going on in the house next door to you. So let's begin. I'm going to have to get rid of this little block I've got in the middle of my screen here. So we're going to begin with our first speaker, who is Angel Bohannon. Angel is just beginning her American Fellowship for the current year, 2022-23. She's currently a PhD candidate in Human Development and Social Policy at Northwestern University. Prior to graduate school, she worked on a research practice partnership supporting mathematics learning for community college students. She's originally from Corpus Christi, Texas, and she recognizes that school leaders constantly experience multiple simultaneous issues competing for their limited attention. She's using an 18-month embedded case study of an urban school district to examine school leaders' attention during the COVID-19 crisis. Her findings report on the school leaders' attentional dilemmas, which are situations where leaders need to make messy, difficult choices between competing, highly desirable values and goals due to the multiple demands of their competing limited attention. So let's pull up Angel's slides and turn it over to her.
Hello, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so very much, first of all, for this fellowship. It really means a lot and is giving me the space and capacity to pursue my writing dissertation work this year. Just to reiterate, I'm currently working on writing up my findings, so some of this is definitely a work in progress, and I would love to appreciate any kind of feedback you have. Yeah, so today I wanted to share some of my findings from my first dissertation paper out of 3. And thank you so much for kind of all that you have done to support this work. So I just want to start off with like a central problem in schools, the problem of school leadership turnover. School leaders play such an important role in managing schools and supporting school improvement. They set mission and vision for the school. They support teaching and learning. They manage operations and budgets, among all sorts of things. But many districts are really experiencing a lot of leadership turnover and shortages, especially in communities that served traditionally marginalized students. And leadership turnover has these importantly negative consequences for students in schools, including impacting student achievement, the culture and climate at schools, and teacher turnover. And in this work, I'm really focused on one particular challenge in particular about every day's leader school work that might contribute to leadership turnover. And school leaders experience multiple simultaneous demands on their limited attention in their daily work. So their everyday work is frantic and characterized by ongoing emergencies or urgent fires. So often school leaders are compared. They're engaged in a wide range of diverse, unrelated tasks across multiple domains. They're expected to do stuff related to instructional leadership, operations, administration, equity leadership, and the responsibilities grow over time and expectations grow over time. And they're experiencing a high range of demands and requests from multiple internal and external stakeholders. Teachers, parents, communities, district leaders, state agencies, partners. So you can see there's a lot of demands on school leaders, limited kind of time, energy, and effort. And at the same time, as I mentioned, school leaders, like everyone else, are human. They have limited time, energy, and effort for managing this onslaught of demands. And school leaders have to make these really difficult, messy choices about what they're paying attention to and what they're not paying attention to. And so a lot of these challenges, not surprisingly, have intensified during COVID. Where school leaders are managing all these new sets of demands related to supporting student learning during remote and then hybrid learning, managing COVID safety protocol, supporting student, staff, and community members' emotional, mental, and physical well-being. And one of the reasons this is so important is, as potentially is quite obvious, is school leaders' work and all these demands and the frenzied nature of it might contribute to stress and burnout, both before and also during COVID. And so this brings me to the central question of my first dissertation paper and my dissertation more broadly, which is, how do school leaders experience and manage multiple simultaneous demands on their limited attention during the COVID crisis? And in terms of research design, I am working on a partnership with these nonprofit organizations that serve half of the school leaders in the school district. And it's an 18-month or 16-month embedded case study design with 10 schools from this one urban district that serves many Black and Brown low-income students that have been disproportionately affected by COVID. I sampled schools based on differing levels of expertise, because expertise may matter for how school leaders direct their attention or manage multiple demands in their attention, according to previous research. All school leaders were involved in this one coaching initiative, and I felt like a coaching initiative and also observations of coaching provide a unique window into school leaders' attentional processes, because coaches have these long-term, non-evaluative relationships with school leaders, and they're engaging in these reflective and conversations that allow us to see and make visible, otherwise invisible and taken for granted attentional processes. So I collected data from fall February 2021 to June 2022 and did 77 interviews with school leaders and coaches. And notice here, I'm defining school leaders more broadly than just principals. I'm interested in everybody who takes a leadership role, whether formal or informal at the school. I did 150 hours of observations of coaching meetings, of school leadership meetings, and collected relevant documents. So in terms of findings, I bring together theory on attention dilemmas and then also on leadership attention to develop this concept of attentional dilemmas. And attentional dilemmas are situations where school leaders are making these messy, difficult choices between paying attention to two or more competing desired values or goals, both of which cannot fully be satisfied due to all these multiple demands competing for their limited attention. And I just want to like shift really quickly to like a concrete example of that. So Principal Beatrice talks about, I was in a formal classroom observation. While I was in the classroom observation, I received a text that one of my employees was suspected of being under the influence. And so I was like, shit, I'm in this observation. I don't want to give it up. I texted my clerk, check for me if there's anything out of the ordinary. That would have been a huge fire, right? That person possibly being intoxicated around children. And so here in this example, you see Principal Beatrice describing this attentional dilemma that she experienced between trying to attend to this emergent, urgent issue that arose and a text about a possibly intoxicated employee versus attending to the less urgent but very important issue of, doing classroom observations. And this is an attentional dilemma that required Principal Beatrice to make these undesirable, messy choices between paying attention to these two competing but both very important goals. So in this case, responding to the emergency of an intoxicated employee at her school versus doing a classroom observation. Given the constraints of her limited time, energy, and effort, or her attentional resources, Principal Beatrice can't solve this problem, but she has to cope with this dilemma by making these good enough uneasy compromises. For example, she can't personally respond or investigate this potentially intoxicated employee so she can continue her classroom observation. And I think this really highlights a couple of key characteristics about attentional dilemmas. There are these messy choices between two highly desired values or goals that cannot both be satisfied. And they're rooted and stem from these multiple demands competing for school leaders' limited time, energy, and effort. And they can't be solved because paying attention to one of these goals or values is making sacrifices on another goal or values. Rather, they're involving these uneasy, good enough compromises where school leaders are paying attention to, in this case, classroom observations at the expense of something else. And so I find across my data that school leaders are very frequently experiencing these attentional dilemmas due to a wide range of difficult issues related to school reopening, ongoing COVID outbreaks, inequities in student learning and opportunities across different racial and social and economic lines, student trauma, and economic insecurity. And all these demands are contributing to school leaders' attentional dilemmas. And 29 school leaders described experiencing 100 attentional dilemmas, or about 3.45 per person. And this is just in my interview data, and I'm seeing more dilemmas in the observational data as well. And school leaders, not surprisingly, describe being overwhelmed and stressed from this onslaught of demands. But I think also they describe feeling discouraged and the sense of defeat from not being able to resolve or solve these attentional dilemmas adequately. And this assistant principal talks about how it weighed on my soul a lot because it felt like we were scrambling to do school at a very minimal level, and doing that successfully did not feel like we were actually making much progress. Just being faced with the choice that I had to make, but knowing there was not good enough outcome, there was no outcome that was going to be a good enough outcome. And I share this quote because I think it highlights a really important aspect of attentional dilemmas, that these dilemmas by their very nature cannot be solved because of limits in school leaders' attentional resources, because they are being pulled between two highly desired values or goals that just cannot be fully satisfied. Attentional dilemmas often involve sacrifice, and they often relate to school leaders feeling discouraged or a sense of defeat because they can't solve what by their very definition are unsolvable problems. And I kind of talked a little bit of emotional and physical and mental implications of attentional dilemmas, but attentional dilemmas also have these kind of big physical consequences for school leaders' physical well-being. So I had an interview with a school leader, and all of these are pseudonyms, by the way, and she wasn't able to make it. And then in the next coaching call, she explained why. Principal Luna talks about, I had 104 students out from COVID, all within a 2-hour span. That's how it spiraled out of control. I experienced a stress attack. I got the severe pain in my chest. I had to drive myself to the emergency room. I became incoherent. I couldn't understand what they were asking me. I could not respond. I just blacked out. And so you can see like attentional dilemmas have these important, not just mental and emotional consequences, but these important physical consequences for school leaders. Yeah, and they're like real impacts for people in their lives during what was like a really difficult time. I want to talk through really I discuss the attentional dilemma, really have time for them, but for the urgency dilemma, the personal versus professional dilemma, the quantity dilemma, the obligations dilemma, and all 4 types of school attentional dilemmas are eliciting these strong emotional reactions. So an urgency dilemma is when school leaders experience the tension of attending to immediate urgent issues that pop up. So COVID outbreaks, upset parents, a potential school shooting, versus attending to less urgent but still important issues like classroom observations, supporting teachers and around professional development. And so this principle kind of talks about, for every minute, there are 100 options. When I open my computer, I have 75 unread emails, and I could easily spend an hour just going through them and responding and not actually helping our school move towards its vision. I can't just blindly spend my day responding to what is loudest, the unread emails, or when I walk into the hallway like the student fight. So this is, you know, the urgency dilemma. School leaders are grappling with all these fires that are popping up all the time, and how can they move their school towards their mission and vision? Both very important, but less immediate issues that are coming up. And probably not surprisingly, due to COVID, this was by far the most pervasive dilemma, with school leaders describing 42 urgency dilemmas. I also want to share one more example of a dilemma, which is a personal versus professional dilemma. And that's when school leaders experience the tension between attending to themselves and their own needs versus issues important to their own school. And this principle talks about being present while everyone else is present, making sure my building was safe. My mom was sick this entire time of the pandemic. She had to go to rehab just to learn how to walk in, how to talk, how to feed herself. I have to suppress all of that so I can be effective while I'm here. Like, I can't think about what my personal life is because it would impact the decisions that I make. I think I was suffering with depression. And this was also a very salient kind of attentional dilemma where school leaders kind of mentioned grappling with the tension of supporting themselves and their own mental health and their own self-care and their families and their needs of their families, and also grappling with like being a good leader for the school and their students. I kind of want to end on some key takeaways. So we pretty much see that school leaders are frequently experiencing these attentional dilemmas or these messy, impossible choices. And I want to note that some of these attentional dilemmas were related to COVID, and a lot of them were, but a lot of them weren't. A lot of them were related to the multiple demands that school leaders have to experience in their everyday life. For example, in the case of Principal Beatrice with the potentially intoxicated employee, and then the everyday student observation. So I don't want to just suggest that this is something that only happens during COVID, though it was probably accentuated during COVID. And why they matter is because they have these important consequences for school leaders' mental, physical, and emotional health. And and that they, like other dilemmas, can't be treated like normal problems. So normal problems have clear-cut solutions. Normal problems you can solve. But attentional dilemmas cannot be fully solved. They involve these unsatisfactory good enough compromises where school leaders have to constantly manage these attentional dilemmas. They have to constantly renegotiate these uneasy compromises as these circumstances are changing. And so supporting school leaders around intentional dilemmas means supporting them in managing these ongoing management of these dilemmas, not these like a straightforward solution. But here I'm also not really trying to suggest that we should just support school leaders in having more strategies for dealing with attentional dilemmas. Attentional dilemmas are really rooted in the broader structural arrangement of school leaders' everyday work, especially those that serve traditionally marginalized communities, under-resourced schools. Like, school leaders are constantly faced with these demands and expectations on their time, from doing everything from administration to equity leadership to organizational leadership to budgeting, and just the nature of their work is increasingly untenable, especially in driven times of environmental stability. And so how can policymakers think about the nature of their work and then think about what that might mean to reimagine that? And here are some kind of key policy implications. How can we recognize attentional dilemmas and develop strategies for managing them? How can we provide additional support to school leaders to minimize their impact on their emotional, mental, and physical health? And how can we reimagine school leaders' everyday work to reduce the deluge of demands competing for their attention? So that's really all I have. Thank you so much. Just want to thank you again for all the support you all have given me throughout this year, and I will be continuing writing for the next year and hopefully looking into postdocs and potentially other types of positions.
Well, thank you very much, Angel. That was fascinating and very interesting information. I know we have some teachers in the audience who probably, and some school leaders who probably empathize with some of the situations that you were describing. We're going to, while we are pulling up the slides for our next speaker, I will do the introduction for her. Monica Reyes received an American Fellowship for the 2021-22 award year after she joined the faculty at DePaul University here in Chicago. She earned a BA and an MA from the University of Texas at Brownsville and a PhD in English Studies from Old Dominican University. Through AAUW, Dr. Reyes was able to complete a book proposal entitled Rhetoric and Storytelling Within the U.S. Asylum Process, Shelter Rhetorics, which is now under contract with Routledge, a publisher, Routledge, and focuses on a study that she conducted at an emergency homeless shelter for displaced people on the U.S.-Mexican border. She investigated how people who seek asylum and those who work with them at the shelter navigate the rhetorical pressures of having to write compelling asylum narratives. Through the shelter community's own interviews, drawings, and photos, her book will demonstrate how sites like homeless shelters provide opportunities for displaced communities to employ shelter rhetorics, which are distinct shared rhetorical practices of daily life, like silence, routine, that both safeguard vulnerabilities and enact an agency for individuals within precarious spaces. So I will now turn it over to, and again, just to remind you once again, that if you have questions for these speakers, put them in the chat box and we will address those at the end of all three presentations. So Dr. Reyes, turning it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm going to also need some help with the slides. So thank you so much for that. So I'd like to begin just with telling you a little bit about why I got interested in pursuing research in this area. So we can go to the next slide. So I'm born and raised in the the southernmost part of Texas. So if you take a look at this map and you look at the southern tip of Texas, so past Corpus Christi, where Angel's from, I'm from Brownsville, Texas. And as you can see, that's directly on the border. So just to give you even more of a picture, where I used to teach in Brownsville, I would park my car in the faculty parking lot right up against the border wall. Many of my students would walk from the sister city in Mexico across the border to attend class at that university. So I'm part of a special community that's very fluid. Um, and many people entering the United States to seek asylum would go through that port of entry in Brownsville, Texas. And just to remind everyone who may not be aware that most people who are seeking asylum are not from Mexico, right? They come from many different parts of the world, but they do use entrance from this port, even if they're coming from African nations, Eastern Europe, China, uh, um, South Asian nations will sometimes travel through Mexico and enter through this port of entry. We can go to the next slide. And when I began volunteering with people seeking asylum at this particular shelter located in my community, I began to understand some of the pressures that they faced as part of their application process. So, the media may depict asylum as a very easy process that anyone can gain asylum. It may take a while, but everyone, can get through the system, and that's simply not true. So, out of the several thousands, not just counting the backlog cases of people who are in the asylum system, sometimes waiting for decades to get responses on their cases, um, only about 16% or less in a good year will actually be granted asylum. The rest will be deported. And that's with a lawyer's help. If someone doesn't have a lawyer's help, that's about cut in half. Um, most of the time that people are recently, most of the time that they're spent waiting for a response is in detention centers, where access to legal help is very limited. Even to make a phone call, they have to pay, or to send a letter to a lawyer, they have to pay for that letter to be posted, and they simply don't have the money or the resources to do that. So when I started to look at the application process, part of it demands that they tell a story about their persecution. So, just to remind people, you can access asylum um, and become an asylee in the United States if you are facing political, religious, social persecution in your country of origin, right? And as you can see on the slide, like I mentioned, this is due because of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group, or you've experienced torture. Um, and so telling these stories is a big part of the process. And the story that people tell is told under very intense conditions, right? So people often have to tell this story immediately when they ask for asylum on the border, sometimes with their children in tow, who may not have heard all of these stories before or understand exactly why their mom and dad are seeking protection. These stories are then told usually to a male asylum officer, so you can imagine for a woman to tell about their experience with rape or sexual assault can be incredibly intimidating, right? And then in addition to that, you can also imagine that people are used to keeping these stories secret in order to survive in their countries of origin, right? And suddenly they have to speak and tell these stories in excruciating detail to strangers who will decide pretty much their life fate, right? And so it's a dramatic shift in their approach to storytelling and to personal narrative. So I became extremely motivated to learn more about this and to see what my expertise in rhetoric could do for people at the shelter where I was already volunteering. We can go to the next slide. So my basic research question when I pursued this study was, how do people who seek asylum and those who work with them at the shelter navigate the rhetorical pressures of having to write compelling asylum narratives? So when I say compelling asylum narratives, I mean that the story that they tell has to be told in chronological order with much detail, and you can imagine that even when we tell stories, right? If we talk about what happened in our day to our partner or our children, our friends, sometimes we'll forget a detail and we'll backtrack and we'll be like, oh, but wait, I also went and had coffee with a friend. Well, if you were to do that in a retelling of your asylum narrative, that would be considered a red flag that you were lying because you forgot a detail of the story. Or if you forgot the date about when something happened, the asylum officer will note that as a possible red flag about why they should not grant you asylum. So those kinds of attributes of what makes an asylum story credible were tremendously interesting to me, and I wanted to see how this community at the shelter was supporting the clients in that way. We can go to the next slide. So, as part of my methods, I was able to interview 17 people at the shelter, and this included clients and volunteers and staff. So, for staff and volunteers, I asked about their roles at the shelter, what exactly they did, their own perspectives about the best ways to support clients who are in the middle of their asylum case or putting together their packet. And then for the clients themselves, I did not ask them about their reasons for seeking asylum in order to, um, protect that part of their story and not drudge up things that may be traumatic for them. But I asked them if they wanted to share specific parts of their journey, they could. But most of all, I focused about the shelter and how the spaces and the people and even the objects at the shelter supported them in their storytelling. Um, and what was particularly interesting in my methods was that I asked the clients to create a visualization to support their, feedback to my questions. So I would give them a digital camera for about 48 hours because a lot of the clients would be gone by that time. So I had just a short window to work with them. So they had access to a digital camera that I loaned them, and they would take pictures themselves without my coaching about these spaces, people, and objects at the shelter that supported their storytelling. We can go to the next slide. So all the pictures that you see in my presentation today were taken by my participants themselves. And these were all spaces at the shelter where they felt support. So here you can see that the shelter space had purchased some playground equipment. They're on many acres in South Texas. And so this just highlights like one of the areas that were important to them for them to reflect about their stories and how to tell stories in more supported ways. So things like their kids having access to playground equipment was a support in their own storytelling, which maybe a lot of people wouldn't even think about, right? But anyone here who has helped raise a child can understand that quite a bit. So some major findings that came out of my research, um, the clients helped me understand something called shelter rhetorics. And this is a phrase that I coined as I was putting together this analysis. So I came to understand that shelter rhetorics are just basically practices of daily life that help the clients feel protected, but at the same time allow them to exercise agency. So I'll give you an example. One important part of the shelter that many clients took pictures of was a round table located, and I'm sorry, I could have included it here. Um, but at this particular table, clients felt like they could come to after dinner and just speak to one another. And again, this was not just Spanish spoken at the table. This was different, a lot of French, people from different African nations, right? And so what they would do is they would use Google Translate to carry on conversations. So they would talk about favorite foods, They would talk about their kids. Sometimes they would talk about their persecution that they faced, but they didn't have to. And that was a big difference. They weren't forced to speak about the persecution and box in their identity as someone who is, faced these terrible tragedies. They were also able to exercise, agency about their own identity, that they're not just someone who's experienced torture, they're a great cook or a fantastic mom, for example. So these different routines, like coming and sitting at this particular space, was part of them learning how to tell stories in ways that were supported instead of forced. I also understood echoes of displacement, and that simply means that people in these precarious situations often tell stories as their environment is able to allow them, right? So one example of that is, silence. So if they were told in their country of origin that silence is the best way to stay protected, right? Don't report your rape. Don't report the persecution you're facing because the government is corrupt in that particular country. Then they carry over that same rhetorical routine into the asylum context here, right? It's such a difficult thing to unlearn if your whole life you've been programmed to stay silent to protect yourself, and all of a sudden that's turned on its head. In order to get protection, you have to tell your story, right? And so I saw clients experiencing this echo of their previous rhetorical patterns from their country of origin. And this played into things like selective silence, right? In order to shield themselves, some people were just simply not ready to share about the things that they faced. And then routine. Routine was a major part of their survival and helping them prepare to tell stories that were necessary in the process. So things like doing laundry, making their own bed, help them have enough agency to, in the small everyday things that you and I may take for granted, in order to have agency in the stories that they needed to tell. And they really helped me understand that things like sharing a dorm room with other people facing similar circumstances and doing chores together opened up paths for them to share bigger stories together. So there was a lot of overlap between these everyday practices and these huge stories they had to tell. We can go to the next slide. So some contributions and recommendations. So part of my efforts are to help legislators understand the harm that detention centers are doing, and the much more reduced cost of putting people in places like shelters instead, where they're able to exercise shelter rhetorics, right? And this can really help us understand sort of the needs that people seeking asylum have as storytellers. Some colleagues and I from this research have put together some community initiatives to help people tell stories. So some writing faculty have helped, lead literacy campaigns for people at shelters to tell stories in their own ways and in their own time. To sum that up, we can go to the next slide. So I always like to, just let people know that if they have, questions, ideas, or solutions, they can contact me at this email. But just a disclaimer, I'm not a migration scholar. And many times when I share about the work that I do, people want to know, well, then what's your answer for the crisis at the border? I don't have an answer. What I do have is research that I've done with people. I have an intuitive understanding of the border because of my time living there. And I'm beginning to understand more about the needs that people seeking asylum have as storytellers. And storytelling is a huge part of the process that can open up opportunities or just shut those lives down completely. So I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions you have. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Reyes, for that fascinating presentation. We're going to move on then to our, and again, if you have any questions for her, put them in the chat box. We're going to move on to our third and final presenter of the day, This is Chinyere Oteh, who received a career development grant to pursue a library science degree at the University of Illinois, Urbana Champaign during the 21-22 award year. After graduating with a BA in American Culture Studies from Washington University in 2002, this St. Louis native began a career in youth development, arts administration, and teaching. She currently is attending the iSchool at the University of Illinois as an American Library Association Spectrum Scholar and plans to complete her M.L.S degree in December. On the creative side, she has examined her own mixed race identity through autobiographical writing and photographic self-portraiture, and has taught photography to young and old in St. Louis. On the collective side, she is a community matchmaker who founded a time bank in 2010 called Cowrie, and I may be saying that wrong, Cowrie Collective, a network geared toward forging economic equity and bridging racial divides, all the while reminding each of us of our rich, our past rich cooperative practices. On the personal side, she's the mother of 2 children and is currently working on organizing her personal archives, which include more than 20,000 photographs. So Chinyere, you are on.
Okay, thank you. Good job getting through that very long bio, and I'm glad that it was included because there's some things that I won't touch on during my presentation, but it's nice to have those details shared. Thank you so much for having me. My name's Chinyere, as Ruth said, and yes, you did say it correctly. Cowrie Collective is a big part of my community work that led me into librarianship, so I'll be sharing more about that today. Can everybody hear me okay and see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just wanted to start off with this quotation from Toni Morrison. So I am in the business, you could say, of studying information, and this really popped out for me. So I'll just give folks a chance to read it. One thing that I'm noticing as I pursue my degree, my master's of library and information science, is how much I really just love information, and I love learning. And the more that you learn, the more you realize you don't know, and you have to keep learning. So I love this idea of progressing from numbers, data, perhaps, and getting to the point of wisdom throughout our lives. So a little bit about me. Ruth shared a lot of my bio. I'm currently in Baltimore. I consider myself a privacy and security focused librarian due to being trained through Library Freedom Institute, which provides online training for librarians and library workers all across the country online, so that we can focus on how to protect different aspects of our personal lives and maybe our professional lives in the online sphere. I'm originally from St. Louis. That's where I've spent most of my life. And I've also lived in Detroit and Washington, D.C. as well growing up. I'm going to skip through some of these because they've already been covered. But down to the bottom one, I'm really proud and grateful to be both a Spectrum Scholar and a grantee of the American Association of University Women. Both of these groups have provided like professional support to me and monetary support that really has made my graduate school experience possible. So like I mentioned, before going into librarianship, I spent almost a decade leading a currency project in St. Louis called Cowrie Collective. Some of these titles or phrases on the side are ones that I gave myself, and the bottom one, the Courageous Experimenter one, is one that a dear friend gave to me. So I'm not sure if folks are familiar with time banks, but I'll give a very quick overview of what they are. Just say that we were all in a time bank together. I am a photographer and I could offer photography lessons to someone. So if I offered my uncle who's on the call 1 hour of photography lessons for 1 hour, then I would earn one time dollar. And I named our time dollar the cowrie to give reverence and reference to the way that cowrie shells have been used as currency throughout the world, originating in China, the northern part of Michigan, even where my maternal grandmother's Native American tribe, the Ojibways, are from, and then of course throughout West Africa. So I would earn one time dollar or one cowrie for that class that I would teach in photography or lesson. And then I would have one cowrie to then spend for 1 hour of service from anybody else in this group. So just say somebody's really good at, let's say, tutoring, and I needed some math tutoring for my son, then I could go ahead and quote unquote cash in that cowrie or that time dollar to get 1 hour of a service from somebody else without having to spend money. So I did that work for 9 years. It was lovely. I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about capitalism. I learned a lot about building community through a currency, which honestly is very hard under capitalism. Because we're so used to using cash as the way that we have transactions to get what we need. But it really helped lead me into the idea of information and resource sharing that is very present in librarianship. So when I ended work, as basically I was burnt out. I had ideas about how to grow Cowrie Collective. I thought about developing an app. And I just was really fatigued, honestly. And so I spent about a year, honestly, grieving the loss of that identity. And I include this in my presentation because I think that a lot of times in our lives, we hear about somebody starting at point A and getting to point Z, but then what happened in between? And I think that in between space and that learning space is really important to share, even if it's like hard experiences that we went through. So I call it my year of memoirs. I didn't quite know who I was after I wasn't doing that really important community work. And yet I couldn't do the work anymore. I just was really exhausted. So I read a lot of memoirs. I have pictured here my absolute favorite memoir, I think, in life. And it's called Heavy. I highly recommend it. But reading those memoirs let me know that other people have pain, have joy, have ups, have downs. And it let me just feel not as alone as I was trying to figure out what next to do with my life. Naturally, reading a lot of books, I guess, led me back to libraries. I grew up going to public libraries a lot with my dad. They're very much a beloved place for me. And so let's see, I have my dates here so I don't get confused. Okay, so in the fall of 2019, I applied to grad school. I got in. This photo here at the top that says, nope, you actually can turn it around to say open. It's a coffee shop in St. Louis. And that's the night that I found out that I got into graduate school. So I love the idea that, okay, that last chapter of my life, nope, we're kind of done with that now, but there's other openings that are happening. And I felt really relieved and excited to have a field to go into that I felt was linked to Cowrie Collective, because I would be in a public library and I would be pursuing a degree where I would learn how to effectively share resources with folks and information. My first job was at a library very close to my home. Here, my daughter is pictured actually before I got the job. In a little cozy space in the children's area. So we all lived through the pandemic and we're still in the pandemic, honestly. And it's been a really hard time. But here's a few pieces of the beauty and some of the frustration of being a public librarian that I pictured here in the first photo. I clearly remember this call where I was on the phone with a patron who was trying to print tax forms. And I helped her over the phone, which is a hard process to do when you can't see what the person is seeing on their screen as they're describing it to you over the phone for about 15 minutes. So I'm a photographer. I just took this funny selfie to kind of show the life of a public library worker is very varied, and it requires a lot of patience. I continued reading memoirs and books of poetry, as you can see, and then naturally, I took many books home and kept them on my own dresser for as long as I could during the pandemic. Here's a few more photos of my time as a library worker in St. Louis at the St. Louis County Library. these photos in the middle or before and after of display that I was able to do on my last day. It's very bittersweet because I was just getting into being able to enact some of my ideas about displays in the children's area and help with the organization of that. And as a part-time circulation assistant, a lot of times we don't have as many opportunities as full-time staff do. So I was really starting to get excited about being able to do that work. Unfortunately, you know, the library did close during the pandemic. So that was my last kind of claim to fame in the children's section at the library. So we continue into 2020 and 21. I began graduate school in the spring of 2020 just by taking one course. Graduate school can be pricey, and my school is quite pricey. Thank you to my father for helping fund my first course. I'm eternally grateful to him to help me get that ball rolling. And here you can see my son and I attempting to homeschool and me, you know, working on a presentation for my first graduate school course. It was hard. I'll leave it at that. It was so hard. I think that we've all been very resilient and we've really pushed through. And it's good to acknowledge it was really hard to be home, right? Doing all of these things that we had to do. So in the midst of all of that time, I did apply for the career development grant through AAUW, and I received it. And I was elated. I'll talk more about the importance of the grant towards the end, but I really feel like it's a very unique funding opportunity for women who are figuring their lives out and mid-career saying, hey, I want to do something different and I want to improve the trajectory of my life. And that includes, you know, a byproduct of that, of course, is improving the lives of my children. So because of being awarded the grant, I decided to leap and move across the country during the pandemic, because I thought, if it's not now, then when? You know, when will I ever have this opportunity with this funding that I can even put towards childcare, for example? So we moved to Baltimore last summer. So here's some photos of me back in the library, different state. This is the Baltimore County Public Library. I worked as a circulation assistant and then was promoted to librarian within 1 year. I am not currently working there. And I really miss the library still. There's a lot about public librarianship that is very challenging that I really won't get into in much detail right now. But it's a really physically taxing job. And while I like being in graduate school and learning more of the theory behind librarianship and library and information science to go along with the practice of being a librarian or a library worker, there's a lot more big ideas. And what else? Like maybe policy change, more support for workers that I would really like to be a part of. So I look forward to doing more like consultancy work with library and archive workers in the future. But the library is definitely still home. Here's a little highlight of 2 projects that I was really pleased with that I worked on last year. I'm not really sure how I'm still here, breathing, eating, talking. I took 25 credit hours this year. I'm in my last course, so I've got my last 4 credit hours that I'm working on. I just thought, okay, I want to finish this degree within about 2.5 years. And based on our new environment in Baltimore and liking our neighborhood, liking our home, having more space to kind of set up a home office, I said, okay, I'm going to go for it. And because I was working part-time for the majority of my grad school career, that enabled me to have more time to take more classes and to study. So on the left, you'll see a research project I was able to do with one of my classmates this spring. I really loved doing this work. It feels good to be able to do research that involves storytelling, like was just being discussed, and include photography and talk to people who are really living hard lives and combating gun violence. So that was the topic of this project. And we were able to present it also to the Urbana city council who was making decisions on how they wanted to kind of monitor and perhaps increase surveillance. Someone's unmuted.
Somebody needs to mute there.
Drunk, but I was zooming.
Oh dear, somebody needs to mute their microphone.
Thank you. So it felt really good to do research that that had a personal touch. I was able to interview folks on the ground in Pittsburgh, as well as we were able to, as a class, make these recommendations to the city council in Urbana, Illinois, which is where my school is based, as they were trying to figure out more and more community-based gun violence prevention, which obviously is a national issue and crisis that we're all aware of. On the right, you'll just see a collage that I was able to make for an assignment. And I'll say that one thing I really love about my program is that I've had some really excellent professors who have given us in a wide range of ways that we can respond to the work that we are engaging with, including writing papers, making slide presentations, doing collages and posters like this, which really helps someone like me who brings a lot of creativity into my grad school program. Here's just a more kind of, succinct rundown of the courses I've taken. I do say that I'm specializing in archiving, even though my school doesn't have an actual archiving track. So my goal is to marry my photography teaching experience, my love of history and storytelling with work in archiving in the future. So in the past, about 6 months, actually, I'm working on building a personal archiving practice. I realize I cannot teach others if I don't get my 20,000 photos organized. So that's what I'm working on now. On the right, you'll see me at BCPL, Baltimore County Public Library, has a preservation station where anyone, the public, can be trained to use software to help you digitize videos, audio cassettes, and even physical photos, of course, scanning those in. And then on the left, I was able to collaborate with a jazz musician and do like live documenting of 2 concerts that he was involved in this spring. That was a new one for me, and it was kind of neat to be involved in a concert, but not be the one who was playing the music. I am going to go through these very quickly because I'm at the end of my time, but I've been involved in so many groups that have kind of shaped what I think about leadership. So I'll just scroll through these so you can just see a couple photos. Here's me leading a session with Library Freedom Project just in September. We had what we call LFP camp, and we got together to do some professional development. And then this is one of the main books that I consult and use in my personal and professional endeavors. And on the right, you can see some of the principles of emergent strategy. And I'll definitely be sharing my slides after, so there'll be time for you all to look through them if you would like. I talked about wanting to go into an archiving consultancy. I was able to attend the American Library Association conference in June as a Spectrum Scholar. So that's me by our sign. We were instructed to take a photo next to our sign. And again, I wanted to say thank you so much. I'll let you all read just my thoughts on this particular grant. And here's my children having so much fun at a local park in Baltimore. We're really very much park people. And that's how we kind of got grounded to our new area. And I think the health and education needs of women obviously do need to be prioritized around the world and definitely in this country. And I can definitely attest to how this grant has improved my life and the quality of my children's lives. So thanks for listening. And here's a way to keep in touch if you would like. The top one is my website. The bottom one is a little bit longer, but there's some more links to things that I have worked on.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That was very interesting. And it is kind of like, it is sort of interesting to hear somebody's life journey at mid-career. And I'm happy that the career development grant was enabled you do some things that you wanted to do. We're going to now take some questions. I know we have some in the chat box, and if there are more, please feel free to put them in. Let's go back to the first one, which was from Paula, and it was addressed to our first speaker, Angel. Do you think that school leaders have more issues than teachers do? So we're talking about this dilemma, attentional dilemma thing. So I guess the question is, how do the leaders compare with the teachers? Angel, do you have some thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I definitely don't think that. I think one of the, and I have a couple pieces of evidence for that. So the first thing is, a lot of the school leaders I interviewed were also teacher leaders. So they were also teachers as well, because I was taking kind of like a broad view of leadership. And a lot of the teacher leaders are experiencing many of the same attentional dilemmas that, principals are experiencing. And I think there's other work on dilemmas previously that kind of talks about, all the dilemmas that teachers are experiencing beyond just attentional dilemmas. When you're in schools with multiple students with all different assets and opportunities for support, and managing that in addition to leadership roles, that seems like you would be confronted with so many different attentional dilemmas. I do think there is some of my data that suggests maybe some of the attentional dilemmas are a little bit different. So we see principals talking more about one of the dilemmas I didn't talk about, obligations dilemma, when they're constantly confronted with people wanting them to pay attention to things not of their own choosing. So like district leaders, district central office often had like mandates or compliance issues that they wanted school leaders to attend to, especially related to COVID, so that's the obligations dilemma, paying attention to things that are not of your own choices versus what you want to do for your school. And principals talk about that the most in my data. And that's probably something related to kind of the principal district relationship at this time.
Yeah. And another question coming from Jackie Curley is, did any of the schools you observed have structural arrangements that eased the attentional dilemmas?
Yeah, thank you both for both of these questions. They're really helpful to push my thinking forward. So that's actually the paper, that's my second dissertation paper that I didn't talk about, where, I'm looking at the different strategies that people are using to manage their attentional dilemmas. So some school leaders were had, as you said, like delegated certain issues to other people that they didn't have to manage, like with Principal Beatrice, she delegated to a clerk so she didn't have to do it herself. There's people that have prioritization practices to prioritize what's urgent, what's important for the school. There's people that have replenishing strategies that are managing their own emotional health and mental health. I would say it really depended on the nature of the issues, whether people could engage in these strategies or not, because, when there is a school-wide COVID outbreak and you're not sure if your school is reopening or not, it's harder to engage in intentional strategies. You don't know it's like complete chaos, So yes, there were different strategies. That's the second focus of my second paper. But sometimes those strategies are insufficient given the huge environmental instability that's happening.
Okay, let's see. We have some of these are comments rather than questions. Cynthia wants to know why Chinyere moved to Baltimore. How did you pick Baltimore?
Yeah, I didn't touch on that. Well, I just, I had a map and I just spun an arrow and no. So I started following Baltimore County Public Library I had a good friend here. I also went to high school in Maryland, not in Baltimore. So I was somewhat familiar with Maryland, and I really liked the East Coast, and I liked having my high school years on the East Coast and wanted that for my children. And then I just started kind of following jobs at BCPL and noticed that they had a new director. And I was excited about the energy of the new director and thought, okay, maybe that would be a good place for me. I also love the water. So I love that I'm closer to the coast versus where I went to high school, which is about an hour northwest-ish or so from here. Also for career opportunities as a whole, because of course I'm close to DC. So there's opportunity to possibly work at a Smithsonian, some year, you never know, someday.
And Faye Marcus wants to know if you've had any involvement in book banning. That's been a big item in the news recently of school boards and often library boards. I don't know if you've had any experience with that.
I haven't had personal experience. However, I learned a lot in my intellectual freedom course with Dr. Emily Knox. She's kind of like a leading researcher in that field for intellectual freedom and censorship. Changed my ideas about things in terms of, okay, we have horrible racist and xenophobic material, but we don't just take it away when we don't like it. We engage with it and we teach people about kind of some of the horrors that our country that exist in our country. I will say that being in Library Freedom Project, I am definitely more privy to a lot of the privacy and censorship issues that librarians are facing across the country. And I don't know that I can say anything positive about it. It's really scary. It's a pretty dismal time for library and archive workers. And what we really need, if I could be president of something, I just really need strong leadership that can help protect library and archive workers to say, we're gonna stand behind you and stand behind these principles of intellectual freedom that American Library Association has put forth, and we're going to push back against the idea of being quote unquote neutral, because being neutral in situations where people's welfare is at stake is not okay. So
okay, let's see. Someone asked a question of Angel, which she answered in the chat. Let's see. Lori Switzer has a question about online graduate school versus in-person. Does anyone want to comment on that? Any of our speakers? Chinyere, you were doing online. I don't know if the others of you.
yeah, it looks like Monica's ready to talk.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I have a unusual experience with that because the Old Dominion University's English Studies PhD program has been via distance for many years, right? So our program would allow people to synchronously take the PhD program coursework alongside people in Norfolk, Virginia at the same time. So this was pre-COVID. We were already like used to this way of learning. And what was so great about it was I was able to do my work along the US border, but still earn my PhD, right? Because I didn't have access to a PhD program, within the closest one was in San Antonio. So that's like a 6-hour drive. So I think that online learning for me was incredibly meaningful. I think it appeals especially to marginalized communities who may not be able to leave their home communities to study. And what that does is it brings these multiple perspectives and different embodied experiences and locations into an intellectual program in ways with that an in-person program can't always do.
Yeah. Wow, excellent. Very, very thoughtful response. Does anyone else have any questions that they haven't put in the chat box? You could unmute yourself and, raise your hand and we can take them. Otherwise, if not, we can wind down this session.
Ruth, I think there was one additional question in the beginning about the attentional dilemmas when they were surveying. Did you evaluate the degree of stress, like 1 to 100? Are leaders being impacted by book banning and sex ed curriculum objections? Was that identified as a particular stressor?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I did not evaluate the degree of stress. I think that's definitely a point for future work. And I would say from all the interviews and observations I did, the degree of stress was very high. It was a lot of incredibly emotional conversations with people, which I think was why it was so important to just be so immersed in a set of sites for so long. And I would say what my research does find is, and that would surprise me, is that it's not just stress, it is being overwhelmed, but it's also the sense of guilt and the sense of defeat and the sense of, can I do this? Like, am I doing my job good enough? Like, these more complex sense of emotions related to these impossible choices when you can't solve the dilemmas. And that's what really surprised me, is how hard people were on themselves because they were confronted with paying attention to two things that were both very, very important, and had to make sacrifices on one of them. And so I think what my research suggests is more of the complexity of emotional reactions than the degree of emotional reactions. But I think, yeah, that is an important topic for future work. And school leaders didn't really talk about the book bannings and sex education curriculum objectors. So I'll let other people or other work speak to that.
Yeah. Any final questions? I think we're starting to lose our audience, so I just want to say
one thing I did want to answer is encourage folks who were on the call, as well as those who are the recipients, is that I got cut off at the end because I talked too long about leadership, but I think a really big part of leadership, of course, is sharing your know-how and sharing tips and sharing resources. So I'm really pleased that one of my best friends that I've known for 20 years got the career development grant this year because I told her about it. So that makes me really happy to know that I really pushed this on a couple of friends, and one was able to qualify and get the funding as well. So that makes me happy. She's in grad school. She's a lifelong kindergarten teacher.
Yeah, that's a great follow-up story. I love that. And we like to do that.
Question about at the border, when people are having to divulge all this trauma, are there medical services to support them? Because again, I have training in counseling, and normally it takes a lot of sessions before people can really open up and share those trauma stories without being re-traumatized.
Absolutely. So I love sharing the research that I've done with professionals in the field of counseling or psychology, because if they hadn't heard about this before, they're always shocked that this is part of the process, because it just doesn't make sense to them after, their expertise in the field, how you could ask someone to share such traumatizing stories so immediately and in such a high pressure situation, right? So to answer your question, no, there's no support services for people sharing their stories at the border as part of their asylum application outside of an interpreter that the government is mandated to provide should they need it. But other than that, absolutely not.
Wow. Any final questions? If not, I'm going to say thank you one more time to our three speakers, Angel Bohannon, Monica Reyes, and Chinyere, oops, I'm doing it wrong, right? No, Chinyere Oteh. So I can see people are applauding there. We appreciate you taking the time to, out of your busy weekends, to join us, and good luck with whatever you do, whatever you pursue in the future. Bye-bye.